Tips on composition. General composition. A composition is to composite all your elements in a scene so that they make sense, right? We don't just put them at random, we put them down intentionally. We put various things on our scene intentionally so that the viewer can read our composition, our illustration, whatever it is that we are creating correctly, right? In a way that we want them to read it, right? It's an arrangement of all of your elements and principles of art and design, right? Your color, your line work, your harmony, your movement, right? You are compositing, you are placing all of said elements into a scene so that they make sense to the viewer as well. Especially if you're working with industry artwork, this becomes extremely important. These are the important parts of a scenic composition. A scenic composition that is closest to us. What do we call that? Foreground? Indeed. This is indeed our foreground. So with your foreground, these are the elements that are closest to us within a composition. These are best used as a framing device. What I mean by framing device is that they are best used as an element within a composition that helps frame our focal point. I will also be talking about a focal point later on. But you notice how these bushes, like if I was to actually finish this, these bushes would be like dark and blurred, right? And they are there to kind of help give us almost like a circle around our focal point, right? They almost highlight it for us. Our background are the elements that are farthest from us within a composition. These elements are meant to support the scene. They are not meant to take over any sort of precedence, right? They are there to kind of give us an idea of where we are, or give us an idea of the scaling of the area that we are in, right? If we are in somewhere that is very, very close, very, very small, consider like a closet, a small room, right? Our background may just be like shelving. It may just be a wall, right? It might be a desk, a bed, whatever that is, right? It kind of gives us an idea. However, if we are in a far range, if we're on the plains, if we are near some mountains, right? We might see mountains far, far in the distance. Especially with backgrounds, we can think of something called atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective is what happens when things get farther and farther away, and it almost looks kind of quote unquote foggier, right? So like the farther something away gets, the closer it gets to like the color of the sky or whatever. And that's like all the dirt and the smog that is in our air becoming more condensed the farther away we look at it. So it creates this almost like fade out effect to things that get farther and farther away, right? So especially if we're in somewhere that's really, really large, really, really open, we may have that atmospheric perspective begin to affect it, right? And that also gives us a sense of scale of how big the area is that we are in. But overall, our background is meant to support us, not meant to take over the scene. So keep that in mind when you are adding in a proper background. Our midground has everything in between, right? It is the things that are in between our foreground and background, and it usually has the focal point. Your focal point is your main point of focus in a composition. It is the thing that your eyes will lead to first. It is the things that you want people's eyes to lead to first. Not everybody knows that you can have more than one focal point at a time. However, if you are going to have more than one focal point, I'd say maximum of 3. But if you're going to have more than one focal point, you must determine the viewing order of said focal points. Right? You can't just put them all in there and they're like, okay, all of these are what you have to look at first, because then it's like you're not organized, right? You're kind of just staring at everything and you're like, okay, but where do I go first? So you can have more than one focal point. And in this case, you must determine the viewing order that your focal points will be in. You organize said focal points with balance, space, and contrast, right? Space and contrast I'll go over very vaguely, but balance is the one that we'll be talking about the most. And that these 3 principles, there are so many different things that can help with your focal points, but these 3 are the most intensive ones that you will want to focus on. So let's begin with contrast. All right, so contrast is how different 2 elements are, the difference between elements, right? The less of one element there is, the higher contrast it'll have. Consider them as like opposite scales, right? The less of something there is, the more eye-catching it is because it is different compared to everything else. With this thing that I have done here, what is the first thing your eyes went to? The brightest red. Fantastic. The funny thing is that you could have said either the bright red or the darkest one. That's the interesting thing with here. This will lead into another thing that we have talked about. But yes, you could have either started on the brightest red and then continued downwards, or you could have started at the dark and continued upwards. This is an example of leading lines, and we'll talk about that later. But the less of one element there is, the higher contrast it'll have. The biggest thing we want to notice is that the farther out we get, that red is still super visible and everything else kind of fades away, right? So the more contrast that we have, the less of one element there is, the higher contrast it'll have. This will give us a general viewing order. Quote unquote, the correct way to do it is, for sure, this is number 1, 2, 3, and 4, because the contrast between each one lowers. If I was to make this even more intense, just add more of these like darker things here. Now for sure, everything is kind of surrounding this. There's even less of this dot here and more of everything else. It almost creates a gradient and everything kind of leads towards that singular dot, right? The less of one element there is, the higher contrast it'll have. So number 1 right here is the strongest contrast compared to this black that we have in our background, right? So the less contrast that we have with something, the more effective our initial contrast will be. Try and utilize this to your advantage. You don't necessarily have to only use high contrast things for your focal point. Maybe you want to trick people into looking somewhere else first and then seeing what you really want them to pay attention to. That's a more advanced way of handling with contrast. So space are where things are placed on a composition, where on the composition something is. By the way, if you want to download a free copy of my notes on composition, I'll link it in the description below. Positive space refers to our main elements. It's our focal point. It's the things that we are meant to be focusing on, right? Whether that be our characters, like maybe you just want a building to be in focus, an object. Your positive space are your main elements, the things that you want people to see, the things that are important within your composition. Your negative space are your supporting elements, your background, your like the wallpaper, the thing that the person is sitting on, stuff like that, right? That is your negative space. Your positive space and your negative space are important to identify because silhouettes are one of the main things that help the readability of whatever it is you're illustrating, right? Especially when we are illustrating something like a character, or we're illustrating like an action scene or something, right? Say if we have a character, you know, like waving, right? If we have both of their legs together, arm is in here, and we have the hand right here, arm directly to the side. And then we've got all these bustling like bushes here, and there's like a bench, and then there's like a light, like a street pole, and there's like a trash can here, and whatever. This no longer feels that like open. It doesn't really feel like it's really, really strong because all of this is buzz. Like it's just background noise. It is our negative space. And this is our positive space silhouette. Not super effective, right? If we instead think about the silhouette of our positive space, maybe if we have this person waving, your legs are farther apart now, hand on hip, one hand up like this, waving. Even as a silhouette, this is still very readable, and then you can have all this buzz around. It's like a bench, street lamp pole, garbage bin, bushes, right? But this person still remains readable as our positive space. Right, the positive space are our main elements, and you want to make sure that those silhouettes of your main elements are readable and interesting. Our negative space, you know, supporting, not as important. Space, however, goes hand in hand with balance. You don't really know how to work with your space if you don't know how balance works to begin with. So, in order to talk about space, we have to talk about balance. Right, balance controls that visual weighting of your composition, right? It is a little bit hard to explain what visual weighting is because visual weighting is something that you kind of understand the more that you draw. It's something that you kind of understand the more that you visually see it. Too heavy on one side and it will feel unbalanced. Let me give you 2 examples. Let's say we have a person running again. The sun. This is our entire sheet of paper. We have the sun right here. Which one feels more balanced to you? Second, perfect. Our negative space should not be taking over our positive space. Our negative space are our supporting elements. Negative space is meant to support the positive space that is visible. So because we have so much negative space here, our supporting is not really supporting, it is taking over the positive space that is right here. Lowering down the ground, making these elements take up just a little bit more space over here. Now this adjusting to the rule of thirds, right? This now feels stronger in its balance. We have balanced out our elements to make a little bit more sense. But let's very, very quickly go over some different types of balance. This is symmetrical balance. It is the same, identical, on both sides, right? If we consider this like a singular axis going down the center, right? Symmetrical is specifically on a single axis. It is identical on both sides. If you flipped it, it would be identical on both sides. Very similar, but not the same as symmetrical. Biaxial symmetry is identical along two axes, right? So if I was to flip this horizontally, right? Perfect on both sides. If I was to flip it vertically, I don't have a shortcut for that, but if I was to flip it vertically, this would also be perfectly mirrored vertically along with horizontally. So biaxial symmetry is identical along two axes. So again, if I was to draw a little dotted line down the center, it is perfectly reflectable along that, and also perfectly reflectable along this. Whereas with just symmetrical balance, it is only reflectable along the one axis. So approximate symmetry is not perfectly reflectable, but it's close. If I was to flip this, it's pretty close to being symmetrical, but it is not exact. So it will be different on both sides. If you are going for any kind of symmetry, any kind of symmetrical work, generally, especially with like compositions for like game art or animation, you never want to do perfect symmetry. So if you want something that's very symmetrical, you go for approximate. You never want it to be perfectly symmetrical or biaxial, because that creates too much unity. It makes everything feel too similar, so that you don't have enough variety within your piece. So if you want some kind of symmetry, you're generally going to want approximate. This is radial symmetry. So this is symmetry that is along rings, right? You kind of get a bunch of rings radiating out from a singular point. If you've ever seen like big, like stained glass artworks on like cathedrals and stuff, where they have like that big like mandala almost out of stained glass, that is radial symmetry. Right, it is symmetry along rings. It doesn't necessarily need to be super flippable, doesn't necessarily need to be like anything like that, but it kind of should feel like it is like a circular shape, right? We want that kind of radiating feeling coming from a specific point. So asymmetry is balance without reflection. There is no reflecting happening going on here. You cannot reflect it either way. You can't flip it horizontally and it be the same on either side, right? That kind of thing. You can't flip it in any direction. You can't rotate it. It is balance without reflection. This is the most common one, and probably the one you are going to be working with the most, and the one that you probably want. But it is one that is difficult to feel out properly. It is one that can be kind of tricky to navigate your way around. It is balance without reflection, right? But this is the one that you're probably going to want the most. So even though it is the most difficult, it is also the most popular. Right, so leading lines. Right, a leading line is a line, quote unquote, that leads and points directly to your focal points, possibly multiple. Right, your leading lines can help the viewer's eyes move around your composition to create an almost like pathway for their eyes to go around to reach the focal point or multiple focal points at once. With this house, we have a pathway leading towards the door of the house, and that also gives us a leading line. You can use perspective. If you have like perspective, and let's say that we have a person standing here and like this rain falling, or like they have a lamppost behind them or something, right? All of this perspective leads us down to said person that's down here, right? There's not an arrow looking down on them, but every element is kind of pointing towards them, right? This gradient kind of helps us lead towards this centered dot, right? The gradient that's going on with the really darker circles going towards this really bright red, right? Leading lines don't necessarily need to be lines, but they are things that kind of help lead us towards our focal points. Get more free art resources as well as critiques when you join our Art Nerd community on Discord. For this demo, frankly, I wanted to draw something simple. You can probably tell by how I decided to copy and paste all of the umbrellas in a second here. Work smarter, not harder, you know. These are two of my friends' Dungeons & Dragons characters looking out to each other in the rain, like spotting one another in a crowd. I wanted to capture that that spotlight in the dark feeling where everything else sort of fades away when you find what you're looking for in a sea of other noise. To do that, I stuck with a pretty simple and common diagonal composition where it's not like it's not like it's mirrored, but both of your focal points can cut like a perfect diagonal within the composition itself. I see it more in photography than I do in illustration, but it does like exist nonetheless. In this case, my leading line almost like quote unquote bounces between the two subjects as they spot each other, right? Neither really begs for more attention than the other, but the visual energy they both give springs back and forth between them because they're looking in each other's directions. Even though I have two focal points on here, technically there are two. This is a case, even though I mentioned it's like, oh, it's like you want to like organize them. This case, I decided like they both have the same amount of visual weighting. It's just that you can pick either or to start at, because realistically, it's like they notice each other, right? So it's like the energy starts at the same time. So neither really begs for more attention, and the leading line is more of a bounce than it is like like you're leading directly to one place. It's more like the energy gets transferred back and forth, right? I think if I were to do this again, I don't think I'd put them both in yellow, and instead would make just their clothes a lighter gray, so then the focal point isn't as quote-unquote in your face, and instead keeps the integrity of the gray, moody atmosphere a little bit better. Join a virtual class in seconds and learn live from professional artists. Enjoy weekly assignments, individual guidance, and real-time feedback on your artwork so you can create like a fearless illustrator. If you learned something new, please like and share this with a fellow art nerd. If you love receiving quality and free arts education, subscribe. Here's a couple other videos you can check out next.